Let's talk about today's message. Today we want to talk about the Passover. Now, many of us have heard Passover because Passover as well, it's something that is a part of the scriptures. One of the reasons we know that Jesus' ministry lasted for about 3 years is because we have counted 3 Passovers in the scriptures, especially in John, and that's one of the ways that we know that. The Passover is found in Exodus 12. And it is a time to commemorate when God brought the Israelite people out of bondage in Egypt and saved them. And it is something that for the Jewish people, they commemorated every single year. And in Jesus' day, Passover was one of those festivals where every Jewish male had, and I say the word had, to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem. And you can find that in Deuteronomy 16:16, where it talks about that. So Jerusalem at the time of Passover grows like 4 times the amount. There is a huge population that comes because all the males come, and they don't come alone. They bring their families with them to celebrate the Passover. Now, in celebrating the Passover, one of the things that you had to do is you had to sacrifice, make a sacrifice. And that sacrifice could be a bull, it could be a lamb, it could be pigeons, depending on what you could afford. Now, because so many people are coming from out of the town and far, far away, they couldn't bring those type of animals with them. So they would have to buy those animals in Jerusalem in order for them to celebrate the Passover. That makes sense, doesn't it? Not all of you bring everything when you go to Florida. You buy some of it there, right? All right, maybe. Okay, some of you do bring everything. Okay, so they had to buy those animals. Now, here's the other thing that happens. Part of the sacrifice is an offering, so they had to give money. The problem is, most of the money that was used in that day was not acceptable currency in the temple. So we needed money changers. Now, there's a couple reasons we think this might be possible, and I was reading more up on that this week. Some people believe it's because on the coins there was a picture of Caesar. And of course, they didn't want any engraven images. Other people will say only certain types of money were acceptable because that currency was of a better standard, which means it was of the correct weight and a better silver. We're not exactly sure why it was not accepted, but what we do know is we needed money changers who would exchange the money that the temple would not take for money that they would take. So can you imagine the city flooding with thousands and thousands of people? The marketplace in selling all of those animals, and then all of the money changer stands to change all the money for all of those people. Now, it used to be that marketplace and the money changers and all of that happened down in the Kidron Valley, which isn't far from where the temple is. But when Jesus gets to town, he finds that it's been changed and has been put in the outer court of the actual temple. He is not happy at all. But instead of hearing this from me, watch the scripture in action.
It was almost time for the Passover festival, so Jesus went to Jerusalem. There in the temple, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and pigeons, and also the money changers sitting at their tables. whip from cords and drove all the animals out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He overturned the tables of the money changers and scattered their coins. And he ordered those who sold pigeons,
take them out of here! Stop making my father's house a marketplace!
His disciples remembered that the scripture says, "My devotion to your house, O God, burns in me like a fire." The Jewish authorities came back at him with a question.
What miracle can you perform to show us that you have the right to do this? Tear down this temple, and in 3 days I will build it again.
Are you going to build it again in 3 days?
It has taken 46 years to build this temple.
But the temple Jesus was speaking about was his body. So when he was raised from death, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and what Jesus had said.
A holy riot. That's what Jesus was causing that day, a holy riot. In the midst of everything that was happening, Jesus was not happy. Now, I know most of us, when we hang pictures of Jesus on the wall, they are pictures of Jesus who is content and peaceful and beautiful pictures. How many of you have a picture on your wall with the eyes of Jesus when he's angry? Yeah, there's not one of us. But that doesn't mean that Jesus didn't get angry sometimes. He did. Now, the difficulty with this scripture is that we want to get caught in the story. And that's why I wanted you to see it, because I want you to see the story. But rather than getting caught in the story, today I want us to take almost like a balcony view looking into the story. Because we need to have an understanding of why Jesus is angry. Because if we don't understand why Jesus is angry, then we are not going to understand his message for us today. So let's look from above down into the story, and let's try and figure out what's happening. First of all, Jesus is going to Jerusalem to celebrate the what? The Passover. Thank you. Exactly, the Passover. This is a high holy day. The Passover, again, commemorates when God saved the Israelite people and got them out of bondage. So here comes Jesus to celebrate God's redeeming power for the people of Israel. Here comes Jesus, the Paschal Lamb, the Easter Lamb, the way in which God is now going to deliver all people out of bondage to sin and death. And he walks into this celebration, high holy day, and all he sees is a merchant's market. And part of what we need to understand is that this is happening in the outer court of the temple, which means it's happening in the temple. Now, here's part of what you need to know. The outer court of the temple is the only place that Gentiles were allowed to come in and worship God. This is where they worshiped God. But because of this merchant's market that is happening, the Gentiles could not worship God. On a high holy day, people are being stopped from worshiping because people wanted to make the high holy day convenient for them. Convenient. Why convenient? Because it was much easier just to walk in the temple, get your money changed, get your animal, get it sacrificed, and then go out on your day. Everything was about what was convenient for the people, not about the worship of God. And the worship was about the day in which They were saved from slavery, about the redemptive power of God at work. And yet they didn't want to take the time to worship it. They wanted to take the time to do everything they could to get it done and over and move forward. Let's make this convenient. Let's put it all right here, and then let's get going. That irritated Jesus beyond measure. I can't imagine what he was thinking. I can't imagine what was going through his head. But here's what I do know. I do know that the scripture says that he took the time to make a whip. Anyone here ever made a whip? Yeah, I haven't either. I don't know how much time it takes to make a whip. Let's just say 4 minutes, right? That's a pretty quick whip. 4-minute whip. We're going to make a 4-minute whip. Jesus had to take at least 4 minutes to make his 4-minute whip, in order to use that whip to take out all of the cattle and sheep and all the other things that are happening in this market. That means he was not just going insane. It means he was not just going off. It means he was being intentional in what he was doing. Because you can't do and take 4 minutes to make a 4-minute whip. Because in that 4 minutes, you're going to calm down just a bit. Jesus was intentional about what he was doing, and that you need to have a deep understanding of, because everything that Jesus does, he is intentional about. There are 2 things that I have shared with you in the last few weeks. 1, Jesus never lies. And 2, Jesus is always intentional about what he does and what he says. That's important for us to understand. So Jesus is intentional about what he's doing, clearing all of this out. And then he's being confronted by the very people who allow this to happen, the religious leaders. The very ones who are supposed to help the people worship and worship well. The very ones who are corrupting the people. And they're angry with Jesus. And we saw that confrontation. And do you remember what Jesus says? When they ask for proof of his authority? Tear down this temple and I will build it again in how many days? 3 days. 3 days. Now, again, do you remember what the chief priest said? It took us 46 years to build this temple. You're going to do it in 3 days? Because he could not understand who was standing in front of him. Jesus, God. And I love the way the scripture is so clear. So the scripture, just so that we don't miss what's going on here, the scripture clearly says they didn't understand what Jesus was saying because they thought Jesus was referring to the mortar and the rocks. But Jesus was referring to his body, for he was the living temple of God. And he already knew he would be crucified. And 3 days later, he will rise again. He's intentional about what he says. He is intentional about his actions and what he's doing. Because Jesus believes in right worship. Another way of saying right worship is holy worship. Jesus believes in holy worship. He wants us to worship well the God of our creation, our Redeemer God. And that is not what was happening here. And he clearly identifies what true holy worship is. Worship that is focused upon God, no matter what that means for us, even if it means that we are called to sacrifice. We are called to worship. How could we not worship the very God who has given us our life? And yet that's not what was happening in the scripture. At least in this particular section of scripture. Now, I want to share with you a theory that I have, and you're going to hear this theory a number of times over the next 20 years that we're together. And I call it the button theory. Now, some of you today are wearing button-down shirts. So you're going to understand this theory more than the rest of us who aren't wearing button-down shirts. But most of us, somewhere in our life, have experienced a button-down shirt. Anyone here never, ever done a button-down shirt, ever? Okay, good. I just want to make sure we're all together. When you put on a button-down shirt, The most important action that you can do is get the first button right. That is the most important thing about a button-down shirt, is getting that first button right. If you don't get that first button right, none of the other buttons line up. Have you ever noticed that? None of them line up. And the hard part is when you don't notice it until the very last one and you're like, what? Right? I'm sure that's happened to you. It's happened to me. I'm not even going to tell you how many times. I don't want to confess that. But if you get the first button right, more than likely you're going to get all the rest of them right because they begin to line up, don't they? So it is with our life and faith in Jesus. We are called to get the first button right. And in this scripture, the first button is worship. We are called to do worship well, to get worship right. Now, part of that worship is corporate worship. That's what we're experiencing right now and what you're experiencing online. This is corporate worship, where we worship together. But there's also private worship, where we worship God in prayer and in singing and in rejoicing and sometimes walking out in nature and seeing the sunrise and the flowers come up and all of that. But we worship God. We give thanks to God who has given us life, who has redeemed us, who has saved us, and who continues to give us life to breathe every day. Worship. When we get that right, the rest of our life begins to line up. That means the very first button ever in life, in any life, is salvation in Jesus Christ. When we get that right, everything else lines up. But I believe that what Jesus is trying to teach us in this scripture is that we need to check our priorities. And today, the priority we need to check is our worship. How are we doing in worship? Is worship about how we are worshiping the creator of the universe, offering him everything, even when it offers us or causes us to make sacrifice? Or do we make worship about our own convenience, about what we like, about the room temperature, the comfortability of the seat, whether or not the music is appropriate for what we like? So often that's what we make worship about, when that's not what worship is about at all. Because worship is about what we give, not what we receive. And that's what Jesus was trying to teach here. All they worried about is what they were receiving. Give me the convenience of having the market here and doing this way. Who cares whether the Gentiles can worship or not? This is about us. We are of primary importance. But not to Jesus. For Jesus is about to become the Paschal Lamb, the Easter Lamb for the entire world. That everyone is welcome into worship. That everyone is given the opportunity to get the first button right, so that the rest of their life lines up. It's only a theory. But the next time you wear a button-down shirt, check it out. And as you're doing all the buttons, check out your life of faith as well. Because Jesus has given us every opportunity to get that first button right. And for those of us who mess it up and things are out of line, he also gives us the ability to get it right.